Hello, and welcome to the Frankenpod, a podcast stitched together from the corpses of mystery, noir, and gothic literature and cinema. I'm Morgan, and I want to talk to you about detective novels. Because we dealt with Sin City for Friday the 13th of April, I didn't really want to go into the works of Frank Miller for long, and I don't know all that much about graphic novels, so I thought I'd take us in a slightly different direction with the detective. The first detective novel is a hard thing to pinpoint. The detective and mystery narratives can be traced back to ancient civilization, arguably visible in the biblical story of Susanna and the Elders and the play Oedipus Rex. Although, let me be very clear that opinion is dramatically divided on both of these classifications. There are examples of early detective stories, not just in early Anglo-European narratives, but in just about every culture with a written tradition. And there are cultures with oral traditions that conform to a similar narrative pattern. A mystery is introduced. Many are baffled. The mystery is overcome, often by a person with particular and peculiar gifts of insight. So it seems we've always loved a mystery. But it isn't until the advent of the 19th century genius detective that the genre becomes certain, defined, and incredibly popular with a wide audience. This also has to do with the printing press and higher levels of literacy, particularly in women. It's kind of funny when we see that a higher proportion of people identifying as female are going a bit batshit for true crime right now, and I count myself as one of them. And it's tempting to think that this is a new phenomenon, but it's been going on since at least the birth of the novel. A lot of women dig something scary or salacious, and so enter the crime narrative. The man who is seen as the first modern detective is perhaps my absolute favourite, the delightfully queer C. Augustine Dupin, created by Edgar Allan Poe in 1841, and often read as merely a French proto-Sherlock. But he is a detective that I have a deep and abiding love for. He is a more relaxed breed of arrogant genius detective than the often violent Holmes. And he hangs out exclusively with dudes, just like Sherlock. He seems to potter around mysteries, make bets on the outcome, and has a strange sportsmanlike attitude to crime, viewing it as a puzzle in a way that would be so popular amongst his successors. I am thinking specifically of Jonathan Creek for some bizarre reason. That's a weird reference that I think will probably have limited resonance. Okay, so this is really important. If you know who Jonathan Creek is, it is vital you let me know via Twitter as soon as possible at the Frankenpod. It can't just be me out here in this 90s BBC drama wilderness. Maybe Poirot is a good comparison, I guess. Certainly better known. But for me, Dupin will always just be a bit of a 19th century Jonathan Creek. If you came here for pure, unadulterated Poe love, you may have come to the wrong place. We don't do pure, unadulterated love here. We have to kill our darlings. Edgar Allan Poe is super problematic in ways too numerous to list without a dedicated episode. He did, however, pen some of the most thrilling and devastating short stories in the English language, and I will never quite be able to reconcile those two things, and I know I'm not alone. Anyway, back to Dupin. The first story of Poe's to feature Dupin is Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is capital B-A-N bananas. I am not going to spoil the end, but if you're going to make the murderer, then you are making an almost explicit comment on Darwinism. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is thought to be the first modern detective story, but it is not the first detective novel. Let us humour for a moment the views of T.S. Eliot, who asserts that Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone is the first and most complete detective novel. And it's true that in terms of sheer quantity and narrative development, you have to hand it to Collins for crafting a tale of intrigue that takes on imperialism, temperance, and superstition. A precious gem has been taken from India and bequeathed to Rachel Verinder, and it then goes missing, and what ensues is a narrative full of red herrings and plot twists. So many that once or twice you may find yourself getting frustrated with Collins's trickery. There are a few good suspects and a few very good motives, and the solution is so outlandish and wonderful. There is also an element of bait and switch. We don't quite know who is the real detective for a while. Even that certainty is denied us. Look, I came late to the Wilkie Collins bandwagon. And the man is quite sympathetic to the characters from India that he writes about, but he also indulges in some casual racism, which will grate on most modern readers. He is often seen as condemning racism, mostly because he writes his racist characters unsympathetically. And for the time, he was actually quite a progressive dude. But all that being said, let me tell you a tale. a tale of a femme fatale, a tale penned by a woman condemning women, giving them an unparalleled level of agency and shining a light on the injustices of the Marriage Act. Lady Audley's Secret was written in 1862 by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, 6 years before The Moonstone, and provides much of what we would look for in a modern detective novel. Barrister Robert Audley, yet another candidate for the most insufferable man in literature, thinks that there is something up with his uncle's pretty new wife. He is the least interesting of the detectives detailed, but the villain is the most morally confronting and interesting. I'm not going to give away the ending because I think it's an important piece of proto-detective sensation fiction. I think you should probably read it. The author, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, is one of those 19th century badass women who had a long-term relationship and children out of wedlock. Shock horror. Not so shocking, really, though, when you read her fiction, which almost always condemns the institution of marriage. She is a remarkable and scandalous woman who wrote incredible detective fiction and wonderful sensation fiction. She made her money as a writer in a time where that was incredibly difficult. And not an underage cousin marriage in sight. I'm looking at you, Edgar Allan Poe. That being said, detective fiction has been somewhat of a boys' club. And many of the male detectives don't tend to hang out with women. In fact, detectives have a long history of being very derisive and suspicious of women. Does the male detective have an intrinsic hatred and distrust of women in particular? Or is it just an ultimate distrust of the human race in general, manifesting differently by virtue of the subservient status of women in literature? It's a question that we're probably going to have to ask ourselves a bit more as we talk about Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, Arthur Conan Doyle, and a whole host of other detective fiction. And I'm just going to leave you with a quote from Lady Audley's Secret. The Eastern potentate who declared that women were at the bottom of all mischief should have gone a little further and seen why it is so. It is because women are never lazy. They don't know what it is to be quiet. They are Sir Amedes and Cleopatras and Joan of Arc's, Queen Elizabeth's and Catherine II's. They riot in battle and murder and clamour and desperation. If they can't agitate the universe and play ball with the hemispheres, they'll make mountains of warfare and vexation out of domestic molehills, and social storms in household teacups. Forbid them to hold forth upon the freedom of nations and the wrongs of mankind, and they'll quarrel with Mrs. Jones about the shape of the mantle or the character of the small maidservant. To call them the weaker sex is to utter a hideous mockery. They are the stronger sex, the noisier, the more persevering, and the most self-assertive sex. They want freedom of opinion and variety of occupation, do they? Then let them have it. Let them be lawyers, doctors, preachers, teachers, soldiers, and legislators, anything they like, but let them be quiet if they can. And that was written in 1862.